Hello, my name is Christopher Preble, and I'm the co-director of the New American Engagement Initiative in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all very much for joining us for the last of our Future Foreign Policy Series events this year. The Future Foreign Policy Series events feature innovative approaches to U.S. global engagement and highlight some new perspectives on how the United States can engage with friends and allies around the world and better serve the interests of the American people. We are so pleased today to be joined by Ambassador David Miller and Ambassador Deborah McCarthy, two experts on the role of reforming the State Department and also better connecting U.S. diplomacy to the U.S. people, the American people, and to U.S. businesses. Let me just do a very quick introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dave, who will go first. David Miller is the president of the U.S. Diplomatic Studies Foundation. He is also a partner and founding investor of Torch Hill Capital, a private equity firm. In his private sector career, he worked for a number of businesses, including Westinghouse Corporation, and has provided business advisory services to a number of major U.S. corporations. And relevant to this discussion also, Dave has recently assumed a very active role here at the Atlantic Council as the first Brent Scowcroft Senior Fellow. And Ambassador Miller will speak first. And then next up will be Ambassador Deborah McCarthy. Ambassador McCarthy is a non-resident fellow with the Transatlantic Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center. She's also a senior fellow in the Advanced Leadership Initiative at Harvard and a host and producer of the podcast series, The General and the Ambassador, A Conversation. It's really my distinct pleasure to welcome them both. And with that, I'll kick it over to you. Ambassador Miller, take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me ask, is this a good time to introduce George briefly? I see George.
There he is. Mr. Lund, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
George, I think you're going to be stuck with listening to me for a little bit. Something you've done for a decade and a half, but
he's unmuted. It says he's unmuted.
Well, all right.
Briefly he was. Go ahead, Ambassador Miller.
Okay. Well, first of all, a great thanks to the Atlantic Council, and especially to Chris and Evan and Barry, who's on the screen too. I spent many happy years wandering around the council, and of course working with George. Let me open my remarks with a short summary of the Diplomatic Studies Foundation activities and objectives. We're a think tank that thinks entirely about whether our country can do what everybody else thinks about. We write no policy papers. Essentially, we are agnostic on policy, but laser-like focused on human skills and assets required to execute policy. This makes us a bit odd in the tradition of think tanks. We are much closer to a tactics shop than a grand strategy think tank. What drove this? A conviction among our leadership of our foundation that over the last few decades, our country has pursued a number of challenging strategies, but we all agreed that poor execution made achieving success less likely. If you like a good deal of reading on this observation, read our NSC and state papers. After some consideration of how to approach this identified shortcoming, we decided to concentrate on education and training of State Department officers, and more broadly, the major civilian departments and agencies that develop and execute our foreign policy. We felt the best way to improve tactical performance was to improve education and training. And second, to improve education and training, the foundation decided to support educational innovation, both by subject and method. Frankly, this is simply learning from foundations that support virtually all of our military institutions of higher education, with West Point providing a fine example. Thus, 3 years ago, we set up our Diplomatic Studies Foundation to support innovation at state, working with and signing an MOU with the Foreign Service Institute. As time allows, I'll review two of our current programs, but I want to leave you with two observations that have guided our work. I have never seen an institution work so hard to select people and do so little to train them after selection. Truly, folks, This is sort of stunning if you've spent your life investing capital and looking at institutions. State is sort of uniquely ahead of most people. And to quote the great philosopher Jim Mattis, bad process beats good people 9 times out of 10, which gets to specifically, where does the work of our foundation intersect with today's subject? Unique approaches to foreign policy, new audiences, new subjects, new methods of teaching. Which, to cut to the chase, explains why I'm here at the Cox School of Business at SMU in Dallas, Texas, hence the lovely backdrop here. The foundation has been working with leaders of the Dallas private sector community, the leadership of SMU, and members of Congress in our effort to construct a range of courses and activities for state officers on commercial diplomacy. We are working both with FSI and the economic bureaus on this project. We are pursuing an exceptionally simple proposition. If you want to make state better at commercial diplomacy, why don't you go to one of the hearts of commercial activity and ask them what they need? What could state do today that would be most helpful? And from that, develop coursework that incorporates both public and private sector inputs. With some luck and skill, we ought to be able to design and implement dramatically improved training of use to both state and our private sector. Frankly, leadership of the private sector is rarely found in DC, and to a great extent, it lives outside the Acela corridor. So a fundamental observation, if you want to work with the private sector, you need to get to know them and they you, which means get out into the country. Georgetown's business school is a convenient walk, but you know, Dallas has more business activity than Georgetown, particularly since Wisconsin went downhill. And as we are fundamentally funded by private foundations and individuals, we have some special characteristics. First, we can move as quickly as needed when a new teaching tool is required or a new subject or an innovative teaching process. Second, we do not need to wait for FY 2028, 29, 30, or 31 to secure financial support for a new idea. Third, we've learned to work with our State Department colleagues as partners to overcome well-meaning but molasses-like rules and regs. There's an astounding sack of molasses. Fourth, we are unrestrained by the ideology of the day, if you will. And finally, we can work with the Congress as a partner with a goal of gaining public sector funding as quickly as the educational objectives are validated. Our effort in Dallas, we hope, will serve as a model over the next decade to get state education and training out beyond the Acela corridor, to use partners in higher education who are eager to help the department and the country. The second innovation we are in the middle of is a 2-day computer-run game with a multi-agency team, state, CIA, USAID, 95th Civ Mil Grade, 3rd Special Forces Group, confronting a country that's facing the disasters of drought, food shortage, political instability, Chinese competition, terrorism, and I think we threw in a pandemic just in case the country team started to relax. It resides in a computer at the University of Maryland. It's a wonderful country called Ikaya, and it sounds a lot like reading the New York Times this morning or any other morning. This program, put generically, is a peace game. We are proud of that. It's like a war game to train the players during the game and to identify over the 2 days in which the game is played gaps in the authorities and capabilities that we identified as being missing as we played the game. We developed this game with funding primarily from the Robertson Foundation for Government with our partners ICONS at the University of Maryland. This development of a peace game is not hard to do, and frankly, most people are surprised that it has not been going on for years. Isn't it a good thing to train our civilians who are in the front lines of fighting instability in 50 or 60 countries in the world today? Who is managing these confrontations? Who's looking at refugee flows and pandemics? It's our country teams. But to cut to a final observation, we are a small drop in a big ocean. We're a test shop, if you will, to prove what can be done to improve education and training at state. The big problem is straightforward. State is rather remarkably behind all of her international civilian department and agency colleagues in terms of training, a rigorous attachment of training to promotion, residential training facilities for most or all the courses, and encouraging training during a career. This is made more challenging as state has become sort of culturally hostile to training, falling back on what they or I would describe as mentorship as the backbone of training. And this comes as no surprise, I suspect, to many people listening, which reverts to Jim Mattis, one of my favorite people. Bad process beats good people 9 times out of 10. Good officers have tried to improve FSI and are there today. In state education in general, people have tried to improve it. Many fine studies are on the shelf, but the truth remains that a sterile dialogue between state and the Congress and a lack of interest by most recent secretaries of state has left state as an institution desperately in need of education reform, which I hope tees up Ambassador McCarthy's comments. Listen to all her fine ideas. What do we need to do? And she hits so many nails right on the head. But we have to use those ideas to drive home the truth that education and training has simply got to be improved across the board for state to provide leadership to our foreign policy community. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Ambassador McCarthy, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be part of this discussion on reinvigorating US diplomacy. And David, thank you for all the fantastic work that the Diplomatic Studies Foundation does. And thank you, Barry, Chris, Evan, for putting on this session. As you can probably tell as I dive into this, it's a topic that I feel very strongly about and that I have focused on both with the council up here at Harvard and also at the Academy of Diplomacy. So what I thought I'd do is walk through and talk about 4 factors which I think are required to reinvigorate US diplomacy. The first, which is taking place, is to continue the shift of our national security apparatus away from the global war on terrorism, allowing our scarce diplomatic resources to focus on other national security challenges, obviously issues such as pandemics, climate change, the rise of authoritarian populism, and writing new economic rules of the game. The second factor is to modernize the legal framework that determines much of the personnel structure of the US diplomatic service. The current law is almost 41 years old. A third factor for reinvigorating is for the Department of State to begin true 21st century strategic messaging. And finally, the fourth, in my view, and perhaps the toughest, is to begin to change the culture of the Foreign Service, including in some aspects that Ambassador Miller mentioned. On the first factor, shifting our national security apparatus away from the war on terrorism, as many of those online will know, since 9/11, the military has played an enormous role in US foreign policy. This was done through policy decisions as well as legislation, which allowed the Department of Defense to become involved in areas traditionally reserved for diplomacy. Yet as we look at our national security strategies, past and current, it's clear that diplomacy is the US tool of first resort. On the goal of protecting the security of American people, diplomats are often in the first line of defense. When the last pandemic broke out in Liberia, as an example, it was the diplomats who negotiated the arrival of the 101st to fight the spread of the disease. And diplomats negotiate the agreements to prevent the spread of nuclear and chemical weapons. On the second major goal of expanding US prosperity, something that Ambassador Miller and the Foundation are focused on, it is diplomats who negotiate and enforce the rules of economic interchange. For example, now new international norms for new technologies, including cyberspace, and they also design and apply sanctions. During the current pandemic, it was diplomats who led on the distribution of vaccines, and diplomats are working on the critical issue of supply chains. And finally, on our major national security goal of defending democratic values, it is diplomats that manage the programs to protect human rights, strengthen the rule of law, fight corruption, and promote inclusion, and also on the challenges of fighting disinformation, digital authoritarianism, and issues such as energy coercion. Yet the department, as we all know, is woefully underfunded. Many in the audience may know that the department regularly faces long gaps in positions due to a lack of its own personnel. I'm not talking about political slots. It's unable to send officers for long-term training and has ingenious rules to stretch or save a few dollars. Going forward, the department needs more people and money to train. The Secretary Blinken, has called for an initial float of 500. In my view, we need much more, and we can get into that a little bit later in our discussion. But when you think of another issue related to the lack of people is the Strategic Planning Office of the Department of State that works directly for the Secretary has 25 people, including several speechwriters. Compare that with our military. On training, a senior officer in the US diplomatic service gets between 33 and 36 days of training in their entire senior career. A senior military officer gets up to 3 years, and that's required for moving to the top. But let me be clear on this first factor. Recalibrating away from the war on terror doesn't mean the end of the critical partnership that needs to exist between our senior diplomats and senior US military leaders, an issue that we explore in the podcast series. And at the senior level, there needs to be a level of familiarity and trust between the two. The second factor required, in my view, to reinvigorate US diplomacy, as I mentioned, is the modernization of the legal framework. And by that, I mean replacing the 1980 Foreign Service Law, which is a labor law, which establishes grades, promotions, pay, et cetera, and also criteria for coming into the service and advancing, as well as criteria for ambassadorships. Some elements should be retained. And I know they've been outlined in an excellent report done up here at Harvard at the Belfer Center. And I think we need, however, substantial new language on training, stronger requirements for diversity, and if possible, the real application of the criteria for qualification of ambassadors and other political appointees in the department. A third factor required, in my view, for reinvigorating diplomacy is upping the game on strategic communication, both abroad and within the United States. The Atlantic Council has issued an excellent report that I recommend to everybody on upgrading US public diplomacy. Let me start with domestic messaging. US diplomacy needs a much broader constituency, both in Congress and in the general public. On the Hill, the current diplomacy/foreign service caucuses need to be expanded to include members who have a background in national security, who are interested in diplomacy, and yet who may not serve in certain key committees. Secondly, the department needs to have more people focused on the relationships with the Hill. Within the general public, to build general support, it means vastly expanding the work of such entities as the department's Office of Public Liaison to engage with new audiences, not those who already know and understand foreign affairs, such as world councils, though they have been great supporters. Overseas on messaging, it means truly having a strategic plan adaptable to regions and countries and integrating data. And on this element, I want to note a critical aspect of a strategic plan is an enhanced effort to fight disinformation. I've written in a couple of places that the current Global Engagement Center at State, which has full authority to fight disinformation and has tried some creative programming, is simply too small, too underfunded, and not part of the frontline teams that currently lead on communication. Finally, a fourth factor, in my view, required to reinvigorate US diplomacy is what I call a shift in the internal culture of the US diplomatic service. And I'll highlight a few aspects. One is the current culture of risk avoidance. Some of this is very much due to law. The 1986 Omnibus Act created what is called the Accountability Review Board. Whenever there's a security incident involving serious injury or loss of life, a board is constituted. This law is widely interpreted within the Foreign Service as meaning there is an overriding requirement to find someone at fault when a security incident involves serious injury or loss of life. So what does this mean? At high-risk posts, it means that officers rarely leave their offices to engage in the most basic functions of diplomacy, which is talking to people, gathering information, and assessing the effectiveness of US government programs. Our military partners and members of the intelligence community are not encumbered by similar restrictions. But there's light at the end of the tunnel. Proposals have been made and may see the light of day in the next NDNA to change the language of the law to have the system more akin to the military. This should significantly help. A second element of on the cultural, let's say the internal culture, is the current system of rewards. The rules for assignment and promotion need to be modified to bring more diversity to senior decision-making and to build broader teams. A number of recommendations have been made by organizations, and the new diversity and inclusion senior officer is making inroads into this process, and my hat goes off to her. Third, on this internal culture issue is the current bias towards traditional analysis versus using technology and big data. Every officer, including senior officers, should be able to work with big data or at least interpret it. I note that the department has a new enterprise data strategy, a new center for data analytics, and has begun to train more junior officers. But this will take time, as the prevailing attitude is still that these issues belong to the IT department. And finally, fourth, on the internal culture, is the current imbalance between bilateral versus multilateral work. More rewards, in my view, are attached to bilateral work. And simply put, others, including the Chinese, are eating our lunch in key multilateral fora, assigning some of their best for years in these organizations. We do not. So I hope this gives you an idea of the elements which I think are important for reinvigorating diplomacy, and more than happy to turn the floor over for questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much to you both. Terrific opening comments to get us started. I have about 15 minutes or so to ask some follow-up questions. So I'll start with you, Ambassador McCarthy. You note the focus of US foreign policy, obviously over the last 20 years, has been on the global war on terror, and that has coincided with a dramatic increase in the role of the US military in US foreign policy. And I think most people are certainly aware of this shift, but perhaps not with the benefit of sort of hindsight. And so I'd love to hear more about, was it not always this way? I think a lot of people sort of assume that it has always been this way, although you point out in your opening remarks very well that in fact diplomacy is still the leading edge of US foreign policy, although it often isn't seen that way. But of course, another key factor is funding. The Pentagon's budget is roughly 30 times larger than the State Department's budget. And so talk to us a little bit more about what are the risks and the missed opportunities that arise from the fact that the US military is so dominant in US foreign policy, and why resetting and rebalancing our approach is so important.
I'll preface my answer by saying, most of our military colleagues support an enhanced role for diplomacy being in the front lines. So it's not as if it's a tug necessarily between the two. And obviously comparing apples and oranges and dollars and cents. And on the ground overseas, whether in high-risk posts, war zones, conflict zones, areas where natural disasters have happened, they have found creative ways of working together. With the additional assets, particularly on being able to engage in certain construction projects and other projects in conflict zones where security is primordial, that is where there's been, I would say, sort of I won't call it mission creep, is by default, the military ended up doing a number of things. USAID and the rest of couldn't field enough people, enough money fast enough, and always had to rely on the military for security. So I don't see it necessarily as always an either or. Another element that stands out a lot that I think is critical going forward, and where both play a role, is in building and maintaining alliances. I think we often think of this as a civilian role. It is an important civilian role, but the relationships that our military have all across the world, some of them long-standing relationships, also assist us in building that network, which is one of the strengths of the United States. But at the top, I note that with under the global war on terror, the limited assets of the State Department, even with OCO funding, were devoted to all the traditional stuff in the national security strategy, plus additional things, with insufficient people. So it's not surprising to me that there was this shift over to the military playing a larger role.
Understood. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to you, Ambassador Miller. You have described both in these remarks as well as the recent testimony you gave before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the State Department culture does not incentivize or reward Foreign Service officers for spending time in training. And you called for more rigorous training, but in what way specifically does the State Department discourage professional development through formal education, and how should this be addressed, in your opinion?
Got it? Am I on?
You're on.
Frankly, it starts at the first day and ends at the last, if you will. The A100 course among international civilian colleagues is essentially half the time that the CIA, the FBI, DEA, so on, train, obviously the military. It's not residential. Almost everybody else says 3 months of residential training is where we build common values. And not having us residential, I think, is a real tragedy. When you get to the mid-grade training, it also is limited. And if I may tie it to one of the key issues of the day, how do we retain minority officers when your mid-level training sends a signal that says, we don't really care about training? Mentorship is the way we train. Mentorship is how they made buggy whips. And if you want to make really good buggy whips, you keep having the old buggy whip makers train the new buggy whip makers. That's silly. Then you get to ambassadors who have a huge responsibility nowadays. I think Ambassador McCarthy's comments were just super. And one of our training shortages is we have ambassadors that go in for 3 weeks of training. Okay, now I've spent a lot of my life investing capital and in management roles, and matrix management, which is what the department has, is very difficult. Even in a coherent organization, it's exceptionally difficult when actually everybody that is in your matrix is reporting to another department or agency. It takes a lot of skill to do this. And so the tip of our spear gets 3 weeks worth of training to manage this. And so I think I would start with the A100. I would end up with the ambassadorial course of a much longer period. And piggybacking on Ambassador McCarthy's point, the uniformed services have provided a lot of the sinews and muscle that have helped our missions play together. And many of our folks are going home. They're going to pivot to the near peer confrontation. So in our peace game, we're trying to get the civilians and the military to change roles. The military is there to work for the civilians. And the civilians need training to figure out what the military can do, should do, and shouldn't do. And so I could go on talking until noon, but I'll stop there.
I know you could. And for those who are interested, please check out more information about Ambassador Miller's the foundation, which has done just such terrific work already in just a few short years. You've only been in existence, right, Dave, for 3-4 years now. Is that right?
Yeah, it's very important to change your name every 3 or 4 years. Yeah, actually, we've been around for 20 years, but we have different work names, and
Okay, very good. Let's switch gears a little bit. I think it's related to that. When people hear the term diplomacy, they often think of people meeting in, from different countries, official representatives meeting in fancy hotels or conference centers. But you two both know how much diplomacy actually happens outside of government and even outside of what Ambassador Miller calls the Acela Corridor. I'd love to hear from you both in terms of your ideas on how the everyday interactions between American citizens, everyday citizens around the world and right here in the United States, businesses, NGOs, how could those be better aligned with the operations of the U.S. government and especially the State Department? I'll turn it over to you first, Ambassador McCarthy.
One key element that I point out to many people is the fact that our private philanthropy in the United States totally dwarfs our official development assistance, and all across the world. The generosity of our country is outstanding. And much work has been done to try to, align and marry those efforts, so they often have parallel but different foci, so to speak, if I'm using the correct English, because I always mix up my languages. But I think where the US diplomatic side is helpful in this engagement, be it by business, by NGOs and others, is knowing that we have their back in terms of being able to negotiate things. Diplomats, above all, are negotiators. They negotiate the entry of things, they negotiate the exit of things, they negotiate unfair treatment, they advise and counsel. In some assignments I've had to advise and counsel some NGOs who are trying to do terrific work with the wrong people, where their money was going to be wasted, and where the poorest of the poor were not going to receive their funds. So that's where there's also important relationships. I think going forward, particularly on issues of the challenges of new technologies, that's where, and that includes the issue of, climate change as well, that more regular interchanges it doesn't have to be an official way, is absolutely critical, because this is where our system doesn't have the knowledge, the wherewithal, et cetera, and can't build it fast enough without additional people to face those challenges and frankly get advice from them on how best to approach an issue in a forum or bilaterally.
Ambassador Miller, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll just mention, sort of as a follow-on to this question. In a recent speech to the Foreign Service Institute, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he called for a significant reorientation of U.S. foreign policy that focuses on the forces that most directly and consequentially affect Americans' lives, livelihoods, and security. And I think, as a follow-on to the previous question and to Ambassador McCarthy's comments, how do we make that connection? How do we, starting with the American people, because I think that American businesses and NGOs and people who are already actively working around the world and making these connections on a daily basis, they understand the value, and like Ambassador McCarthy says, of sort of having skilled negotiators on your side, so to speak, or working with you. How do we also make a connection to the American people?
The best way to connect with anybody is to have a shared project. Period. I don't care if that's your Cub Scout troop or if it's U.S. business. What we're trying to do here in Dallas is to develop the simple Venn diagram that says, here are national economic strategic interests, here's sale of property, so on and so on. Here's SMU, here's the Dallas private sector. We are losing a competition to China, where they have a fine integration of their private sector and their strategic objectives. So frankly, the best way to get the State Department out into the country is to get them up to Cambridge, bring them out to Dallas, take them out to San Francisco. You want to learn about new computer technologies, you can find that in San Francisco. You want to learn about American industry, bring them here. So I think if you ask the American citizens to help their State Department, I think the outpouring of interest would be outstanding. That's what we have found here. I think that's what you will find across the board. The challenge in my mind is helping the department get over the idea that only foreign service officers understand how to teach other foreign service officers, and that all wisdom will be found between the department and the Georgetown campus, and that people should come into state to help teach. Half of the gap is cultural. And you don't learn culture by having a spokesperson from the Fluor Corporation pitch up at FSI. You learn business culture by coming to Dallas for a week or two and sitting in a classroom, going to a company, having a drink, having dinner, going out and getting to know each other. So that's a very simple approach of mine to how to get state out into the country. I think the country would welcome state.
Chris, if I can just jump in here.
Please
I think
go ahead, please.
It's
Yes.
really, really important that state, no matter what mechanism is used, really explain to the American people that they are helping protect their health. They're helping them protect from cyber. They're helping, on the prosperity agenda, the deals, the opening, the supply chain, and helping to set the rules that will protect the future of their kids and grandkids on climate change. Those are topics that need to be discussed a lot more.
If I may have a follow-on comment, I could not agree more. And the way that we've watched that dialogue develop here is getting people from both sides to look at problems. In particular, if you limit yourself just to commercial diplomacy, you get back to selling goods, FOB, Legos. You don't have to have so much help other than getting it off the ship. Pretty soon you're beginning to look at assembly in country. Then you're beginning to look at investing capital, so on and so forth. The role of the State Department grows as the exposure of the US corporation grows. And so the way I think we prove the value of state to many citizens is to say, have you thought about health challenges in the country where you're investing? You know what assets we at state have. And I think if the more we can get these two sides into the same room to trade ideas, I think that's a ways down the road toward building bridges.
Excellent. Thank you both. We didn't get a chance to address just only briefly the point about the role that the State Department plays on issues ranging from climate change to and disinformation and misinformation. I think we get another entire program along those lines, and I encourage. I'll welcome you both back for another event in 2022. But with that, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Mr. George Lund. Mr. Lund is the chairman of Torch Hill Investment Partners and a longtime experienced chief executive and business person. He also is Atlantic Council board director and the Atlantic Council's treasurer. So I'm so pleased that Mr. Lund was able to join us today, and I'll turn the program over to him for some concluding remarks. George. Thank
you, Chris. First of all, let me thank Ambassadors Miller and McCarthy for their time and fantastic remarks today. I also want to recognize and thank Barry and Chris, the other ACS leaders here, and the wider team that helped put all of this together. And many thanks indeed to everybody who joined us today and listened to this important discussion. As Chris was just saying, I chair the Finance and Investment Committee, which I sometimes call the Ways and Means Committee here at the Atlantic Council. And I believe that this subject today is, the greatest possible importance for the Atlantic Council. The Scowcroft Center, which is something I've been involved with, from its very stand-up, works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies that face the most critical security issues facing the United States. And in that way, we try to embody the ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security and support the U.S. interests around the world in cooperation with allies and partners. And you can't say that line without putting the Department of State at the very center of it. It is the pivot point for everything that I just said, why the Scowcroft Center exists. And I want to really just leave you with 3 points. I've been working with David Miller for many years, and we have spent a lot of hours with a lot of colleagues at all levels of both government service and private sector, talking about this issue of how to elevate the work of the Department of State. And I think everybody knows that the nature of the work is of the greatest possible importance. And the question is, how does the institution, I think, regain its proper stature in our national posture? And I look at the work which I do support personally and financially of the U.S. Diplomatic Foundation as a pilot program. One of the things that we do, I think, fairly well in the private sector is we get out there and we see if something works. And I think the peace games, for example, are a tremendous example of something that demonstrates a way forward. And I think the comments of the ambassadors both highlighted that the training and promotion and immersion in both the not just the foreign culture, which is of huge significance, but in U.S. culture is of huge significance. And we have to start that somewhere. And we hope that something like the Peace Games can be part of that, and that this training effort can propel it forward. I've also, as David knows, and it's been talked about here, I believe Congress is central to this. We cannot move this forward without legislation. This is not an administration issue. We've had Republican and Democratic administrations come back through for the last 40 years, and this thing has continued to atrophy administration after administration after administration. Ambassador McCarthy hit on several salient examples, and to some degree, until we can get the committees in Congress to start grappling with this, we're just not going to see this thing change. And it's hugely important. And then finally, we've been at limited conflict for 40 years now. And where has it left us? We have got to put diplomacy at the center of this thing. It is the greatest possible strategic challenge for the United States. To me, it's not China, it's not other parts of the world, it's within us, and it's right here. And if we cannot get America engaged with the world, this will not end well. And the only way we can do that is through something called the Department of State. We have been trying it through the Department of Defense, and it has not been working. And so, they're fantastic people, and we need them in every possible way. But we are engaged in a global dialogue right now on enormously important issues, and the Department of Defense is not the tool designed to do that. The tool designed to do that is the Department of State. And so I think this is of super significance for what we're doing here at the Atlantic Council and for the country as a whole, and essentially for the cause of peace. And so I want to thank everybody again who's been involved with it. I thank all of you for tuning in. I hope you can join us again on a future session of this kind, and wish you all the best for a great week ahead. Take care.